The auditorium at Northwood High always smelled the same. It was a mix of old floor wax, the faint scent of dust dancing in the sunbeams that slanted through the high windows, and the unmistakable aroma of teenage boredom. It was the smell of 1,000 assemblies just like this one. Students were packed onto the hard, squeaky wooden benches, a restless sea of whispering, texting, and fidgeting. Near the back, a couple of boys were tossing a crumpled piece of paper back and forth, their laughter sharp and disruptive. Amidst all this noise and movement, Maya was a small, still island. She sat near the front, not because she wanted to be close to the action, but because it was easier to disappear when there were more people in front of you. Her shoulders were hunched forward, making her seem smaller than she already was. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her worn-out sneakers were tucked neatly under the bench, as if she was trying to hide their scuffed toes. In her lap she clutched a tattered blue folder. The edges were frayed and soft from years of being held, and a rubber band was stretched around it to keep the contents from spilling out. This folder was her shield, her anchor, her entire world. While the other kids were focused on their phones or their friends, Maya's world wasn't in this room at all. It was in the worn pages of that folder, tucked between the black lines and treble clefs of her sheet music. In her mind, she could already hear the notes, feel the weight of the piano keys under her fingers. Music was the one place where she didn't feel small or quiet. It was a language she could speak fluently, a world where she was powerful and in complete control. Here, in this noisy auditorium, she was just the quiet girl who always kept her head down. On the other side of the aisle, a different kind of world was unfolding. A girl with a perfectly styled blonde ponytail and a cheerleading sweater sat surrounded by a circle of friends. She was the kind of person who didn't just enter a room. She lit it up with her presence. Her laugh was confident and carried easily over the general murmur of the crowd. She was leaning back in her seat, looking effortlessly cool, her polished nails tapping a rhythm on her knee. She was the center of her own solar system, and everyone else was just a planet orbiting around her. On the stage, the principal, Ms. Albright, adjusted her glasses and tapped the microphone. The feedback squealed, causing a few students to wince and cover their ears. "All right, everyone, settle down," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the large room. "As you know, the annual talent show is just 2 weeks away. We have some fantastic acts signed up this year, and I'm here to read the list of performers for the assembly." A collective groan rippled through the students. The principal began to read from a clipboard, her voice a monotonous drone. "We have a dance performance from the junior varsity squad. A magic act. A comedy routine." Each name was met with a small burst of applause or a few cheers from friends. Maya barely listened. She just kept her eyes fixed on her folder, tracing the worn-out edges with her thumb. She knew her name was on that list. She had signed up herself, her hand shaking so much she could barely write. It was the bravest thing she had ever done. Then Miss Albright's voice cut through her thoughts. "And next we have a piano performance from Maya Shun." The moment her name was spoken, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first. A few snickers from the back. A glance exchanged between the girl with the blonde ponytail and her friend. The girl leaned over, her hand cupped around her mouth to whisper in her friend's ear. But she didn't whisper quietly enough. Her voice, laced with a sweet, venomous amusement, carried clearly in the sudden lull. "Oh, this should be boring," she said, her eyes fixed on Maya's back. "Maybe she played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star for us. That was the spark?" The whisper was a perfectly aimed dart, and it hit its target. A few people nearby heard it and giggled. Then the giggles spread like ripples in a pond. Soon, a wave of collective, mocking laughter was washing over the entire auditorium. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was everywhere. It was in the snorts from the boys in the back, the high-pitched titters from the popular girls, and the smirks from the kids who just wanted to be part of the joke. For Maya, the sound was like a physical blow. It felt like 1,000 tiny pinpricks on her skin, and a hot, prickling heat rushed to her face. She could feel her cheeks burning, a deep, painful crimson that she knew everyone could see. She wanted to melt into the wooden bench, to sink right through the floor and into the cool, dark earth below. She gripped her folder so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The music, the beautiful, powerful world that lived inside those pages, suddenly felt a million miles away. The laughter felt like it lasted for an eternity, though it was probably only 10 seconds. It was a public confirmation of everything she feared, that she was invisible, that she was weird, that she didn't belong. These people didn't know her. They didn't know about the hours she spent practicing on her old second-hand piano at home, the calluses on her fingers, or the way her heart soared when she played a difficult piece perfectly. To them, she was just Maya Chun, the quiet girl in the front row. An easy target for a cheap laugh. On the stage, Ms. Albright cleared her throat. A hint of disapproval in her expression, but she didn't say anything. She just moved on to the next name. The laughter died down, replaced by an awkward silence, but the damage was done. Maya could still feel the eyes on her, the lingering smirks. She didn't look up. She couldn't. She just stared at her folder, at the familiar, comforting lines of the music, and tried to pretend she was somewhere else. But the laughter echoed in her ears, a cruel reminder that in this world, outside of her music, she was small and powerless. The walk to the stage in 2 weeks suddenly felt like a journey to the gallows. The acts that followed were a complete blur to Maya. It was like watching a movie with the sound off and the screen out of focus. She saw a group of girls in sparkly costumes dance to a song she didn't recognize, their movements sharp and synchronized. She saw a boy try to pull a rabbit out of a hat, only for the hat to be empty, which drew a few sympathetic chuckles. She saw another boy tell jokes that she couldn't hear over the roaring in her own ears. All of it was just noise and motion, a colorful but meaningless distraction from the storm. Raging inside her, the laughter from earlier was still echoing in her mind. It wasn't just a memory. It was a living thing, a monster that had taken up residence in her head, replaying its cruel soundtrack on a loop. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see the smirking faces, could feel the weight of their judgment. Her blue folder, usually a source of comfort, now felt heavy in her lap, a reminder of the vulnerability that had just been exposed. She traced the frayed edges with a trembling finger, the worn cardboard feeling rough against her skin. Why had she signed up? What had made her think, even for a second, that she could do this? She was just Maya, the quiet girl who faded into the walls. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't brave. She thought about her piano at home. It was an old, second-hand upright that her parents had bought for her when she was 7. It had a few keys that were slightly yellowed, and one of the pedals stuck a little sometimes. But to her, it was perfect. It was her sanctuary. In her small, quiet living room, with the afternoon sun streaming through the window, she was a queen. The piano was her kingdom, and the notes were her subjects. She could make them weep. She could make them soar. She could make them dance. There, she wasn't shy or awkward. She was powerful. But this was not her living room. This was a stage, and the kingdom was filled with a crowd that had already crowned her a fool. Time seemed to both crawl and fly. One moment, it felt like hours had passed, and the next, the principal was back at the microphone. "Thank you to all our performers for that wonderful preview," Miss Albright said, her voice cheerful and bright. "And now, for our final act of the assembly, please welcome one more time to the stage, Maya Chun." The sound of her name again, this time as an introduction, sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. This was it. There was no more time? The monster in her head let out a triumphant roar. Her heart started hammering against her ribs, so hard and fast it felt like a trapped bird trying to break free. Her palms were sweaty, as she could feel a trickle of sweat make its way down her back. She was going to be sick. She was sure of it. For a wild, desperate second, she thought about just staying put. She could pretend she didn't hear. She could pretend she was sick. A teacher would come over, and she could say she didn't feel well, and they would let her leave. It would be embarrassing, but it wouldn't be this. It wouldn't be this public, this humiliating. But then she saw a teacher from the front row give her a small, encouraging nod. And she knew she couldn't. She had signed up. She had to see it through. With legs that felt like they were made of lead, Maya pushed herself up from the hard wooden bench. Every eye in the auditorium seemed to swivel in her direction at once. The walk from her seat to the aisle was only a few steps, but it felt like crossing a vast, empty desert. She could hear the shuffle of her own worn-out sneakers on the sticky floor, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the room. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the floor, counting the scuff marks and discarded pieces of paper as if they were a map to safety. As she started down the aisle, the rows of students on either side of her became a blur of faces and legs. She could feel their stares like a physical pressure, pushing in on her from all sides. She imagined what they were thinking. Look at her. She's actually going to do it. I wonder if she'd cry. The girl with the blonde ponytail was watching her. She could feel it. She didn't have to look up to know that the girl's face was a mask of smug anticipation, waiting for the train wreck to happen. The steps leading up to the stage were steep and seemed to go on forever. Her hand trembled as she gripped the metal railing, its cool surface a small, sharp reality in the midst of her dizzying fear. When her feet finally touched the wooden surface of the stage, it felt like stepping onto another planet. The world tilted. The lights, which had seemed pleasant from her seat, were now blindingly bright, hot white beams that seared her eyes and turned the audience into a dark, faceless void. She couldn't see individuals anymore, just a massive black hole of silent judgment, and there it was. The piano. It sat in the center of the stage, a huge, polished black monster. It looked so much bigger and more intimidating than her old upright at home. It gleamed under the lights, a perfect, beautiful, and terrifying instrument. It seemed to be waiting for her, challenging her. You don't belong here, it seemed to say. You are not good enough. A wave of panic so intense it almost buckled her knees washed over her. This was a mistake. A huge, horrible mistake. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick and heavy, and she couldn't get enough of it into her lungs. The music in her head was gone, replaced by a high-pitched ringing sound. Her fingers were numb. How could she possibly play with numb fingers? She should run. She should just turn around, run down those steps, and out of the auditorium and never come back. It was the only sensible thing to do. She stood there, frozen in the blinding light, a tiny, terrified statue. The silence from the crowd was deafening. It was heavier and more oppressive than the laughter had been. It was the silence of expectation, the quiet before a fall. She could feel a tear well up in the corner of her eye, a hot, salty drop of defeat, but then something shifted. Deep inside her, behind the fear and the panic, a tiny spark flickered. It was a memory of being 8 years old, struggling with a particular chord, her fingers too small to reach all the notes. She had been so frustrated she had wanted to slam the keyboard lid shut and never play again. But her mother had sat beside her, put her arm around her small shoulders, and said, "Close your eyes, Maya. Don't look at your hands. Just hear the music in your head. Your fingers know the way. You just have to let them find it." So standing there on the stage with hundreds of eyes on her, Maya did just that. She closed her eyes. The blinding lights disappeared. The faceless crowd vanished. The monster in her head went quiet. She took one single, shaky breath and then another. And in the darkness behind her eyelids she began to hear it. Faintly at first, then clearer. The first notes of her piece. The music was still there. It had been waiting for her. Her legs, which had been filled with lead, suddenly felt a little bit stronger. She took a step forward and then another until she was standing right in front of the piano. The black wood was smooth and cool under her fingertips. She reached out and gently lifted the lid, revealing the pristine black and white keys. They weren't a monster anymore. They were just keys, and they were waiting. She slowly lowered herself onto the bench, its worn velvet a familiar comfort. The world was still waiting, but for the first time since she had stood up, Maya felt like she might just be able to give them what they came for. The world behind her closed eyelids was quiet and dark. It was a safe place, a pocket of peace in the middle of a war. The blinding stage lights were gone, the faceless crowd had vanished, and the only sound was the steady, calming rhythm of her own heart. She could still feel the velvet of the piano bench beneath her, a solid, real thing that kept her grounded. Her mother's words were a gentle echo in her mind. Asterisk, just hear the music in your head. Your fingers know the way, asterisk, and she could hear it. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It was alive. It started as a single, clear note, hanging in the darkness of her thoughts. Then another and another, slowly weaving together into the complex, fiery melody she had practiced for months. This piece was her favorite, not because it was beautiful, but because it was honest. It was full of anger and sadness, but also of a fierce, unbreakable strength. It was the story of every time she had ever felt small or overlooked, every time she had been whispered about or laughed at. It was all her frustration and all her hope poured into sound, but the fear was not completely gone. It was a quiet monster now, hiding in the corners of her mind. It whispered to her in the silence. They're still out there, it hissed. Asterisk, they're waiting for you to mess up. The girl with the perfect ponytail is smirking right now. They all think you're a joke. Asterisk Maya felt a tremor of doubt run through her. Her hands, resting in her lap, began to shake again. She fought back. She pushed the monster's voice away and focused harder on the music. She pictured her living room at home. She saw the afternoon sun streaming through the window, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air. She saw her old, faithful piano with its slightly yellowed keys. She could almost feel the familiar, comfortable stick of that one pedal. In her mind, she was not on a stage in front of hundreds of people. She was at home, safe and alone, playing just for herself. The music was her secret, and she was about to share it, but only on her own terms. Taking another deep breath, this one a little steadier than the last, Maya opened her eyes. The world rushed back in the hot lights, the vast, dark room, the silent piano in front of her. But it didn't seem as scary anymore. The monster in her head was smaller now, its voice fainter. She was in control. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hands from her lap and brought them to the keys. Her fingers were still trembling, just a little, but as they hovered over the cool ivory and smooth ebony, a sense of calm washed over her. This was familiar. This was right. She had done this 1,000 times. Her right hand found its position, her fingers curling naturally over the keys. Her left hand followed, settling into place lower down on the keyboard. For a moment, she just let them rest there, feeling the coolness of the plastic against her skin, connecting with the instrument. It was like greeting an old friend. The auditorium was so quiet she could hear the soft hum of the lights overhead. She could feel the collective breath of the audience, held in anticipation. They were expecting something soft, something boring, something they could laugh at. They were expecting Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Maya's fingers stilled. The last whisper of doubt vanished. She was ready. She didn't start gently. She didn't ease into it. She struck the first chord with all the force she could muster. The sound that exploded from the piano was not a melody. It was a declaration. It was like a crack of thunder in a silent room, a sharp, violent, and utterly shocking noise that seemed to physically shake the air. It was a cluster of notes, dissonant and angry, that hung in the air for a split second before ringing out with a raw, frantic energy. It was the sound of a door being kicked open. The sound of a shout that had been held in for far too long. The effect on the room was instantaneous. An absolute dot. It was as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire world. The quiet shuffling, the soft coughs, the faint rustle of programs, all of it ceased. The silence that followed the first chord was heavier and more profound than the one that had come before it. It was a silence born not of boredom but of pure, unadulterated shock. In the front row, the girl with the blonde ponytail physically flinched. Her hand, which had been cupped around her chin in a pose of bored expectation, dropped to her lap. The smirk that had been painted on her face for the last 20 minutes vanished, wiped away as if by an invisible hand. Her mouth, which had been ready to whisper another sarcastic comment, fell slightly open. Her eyes, which had been full of condescending amusement, were now wide with disbelief. The change rippled through the auditorium like a wave. The boy who had been tossing the crumpled paper ball froze, his hand halfway through the motion. The girls who had been whispering and giggling snapped their heads toward the stage. their expressions shifting from mockery to confusion. Bored students who had been staring at their phones or the ceiling suddenly looked up, their faces drawn and alert. The entire energy of the room shifted in a heartbeat. The invisible wall of judgment and indifference that had been pressing in on Maya shattered into a million pieces. Maya felt it. Even with her focus locked on the keys, she felt the change. The hostile pressure that had been weighing on her shoulders lifted, replaced by a new kind of tension. It was the tension of absolute, undivided attention. They were no longer waiting for her to fail. They were trying to understand what was happening. She didn't give them time to figure it out. Before the echoes of the first chord had even faded, her fingers were moving. They flew across the keys with a speed and aggression that seemed impossible coming from the quiet, hunched girl they had laughed at minutes earlier. The notes were a torrent, a cascade of sound that was both chaotic and precise. It was a furious, driving rhythm that was complex and demanding. A whirlwind of sound that grabbed the listener by the collar and refused to let go. This was not the performance of a shy, nervous student. This was a confession. It was the sound of every suppressed feeling, every moment of loneliness, every quiet act of defiance, all given a voice. The shy, quiet girl was still there, sitting on the bench, but she was no longer in control. The music was. And the music was furious, and it was magnificent. The whole class had laughed at her, but now not a single person made a sound. They were simply captivated, their eyes fixed on the small figure at the piano, who had just commanded the room with a single, powerful chord. The silence that followed the first chord was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, pressing down on everyone in the auditorium. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just been proven completely wrong, and they were all scrambling to catch up. But Maya didn't give them a chance. Her fingers, which had seemed so meek and clumsy when she held her books, were now possessed by a frantic energy. They didn't just play the notes. They attacked them. The music that poured out of the piano was a storm. It was a whirlwind of sound, so fast and complex that it was hard to believe it was coming from just one person and one instrument. Her right hand flew across the higher keys, a blur of motion creating a melody that was sharp and angry, like shards of glass flying through the air. Her left hand provided a thundering, powerful rhythm on the lower keys, a relentless beat that felt like a pounding heart filled with rage. This wasn't just a song. It was a battle. And Maya was winning. As she played, a change came over her. The hunched, scared girl who had walked onto the stage was gone, completely erased by the power of the music. Her back straightened. Her shoulders, which had been curled in on themselves, pulled back. Her head lifted, and for the first time, she seemed to be looking out at the audience, not through them. Her eyes were closed, but her face was alive with expression. It was a mask of pure passion and concentration. Her lips were pressed together in a firm line, and a small muscle twitched in her jaw. She wasn't just pressing keys anymore. She was pouring every ounce of her being into the instrument. The piano was no longer a separate thing. It was an extension of herself, a voice for all the things she could never say. The audience was mesmerized. It was like watching a transformation happen in real time. The boy in the back row who had been tossing the paper ball was now leaning so far forward in his seat he was in danger of falling off. His mouth was hanging open, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. The girls who had been whispering were now completely still, their faces turned toward the stage, their expressions blank with disbelief. No one was looking at their phones. No one was whispering to their friends. Every single person in that room was locked in, captivated by the raw, untamed energy coming from the stage. The music was a story, and it was telling them everything they didn't know about the quiet girl in the front row. It told them about the loneliness of sitting by herself at lunch. It told them about the sting of being ignored. It told them about the quiet anger that builds up inside when you're treated like you're invisible. It was a furious, beautiful, and heartbreaking confession. And it was happening in front of everyone. Then, just as the storm of sound reached its peak, something incredible happened. The music changed, the furious, driving rhythm softened. The angry, sharp melody melted away, replaced by something completely different. It was a simple, hauntingly beautiful tune that emerged from the chaos like a single ray of sunlight breaking through a dark cloud. Maya's hands, which had been flying across the keys, slowed down. Her touch became gentle, almost tender. The notes she played now were soft and clear, each one hanging in the air like a perfect, shimmering tear drop. The mood in the auditorium shifted again. The tension that had been so thick a moment ago dissolved, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. The storm had passed, and now they were left in the quiet aftermath, looking at the damage. This new part of the music was full of longing and a deep, profound sadness. It was the sound of wanting to belong, of wanting to be seen. It was the sound of a heart that had been hurt one too many times. In the front row, the girl with the blonde ponytail felt a strange and unfamiliar tightening in her chest. She watched Maya, really watched her for the first time. She saw the way the girl's body swayed with the gentle melody, the way a single tear escaped from under her closed eyelid and traced a slow path down her cheek. The girl thought about the whisper she had made, about the cruel laughter she had started. At the time, it had seemed like a harmless bit of fun, a small way to assert her place at the top of the school's social ladder. But now, hearing this music, she felt a wave of shame wash over her. She realized that the quiet girl she had mocked wasn't boring or weird. She was a person with deep feelings, with a world of emotion inside her that was more real and more powerful than anything the blonde girl had ever experienced. The smirk was long gone from her face, replaced by a look of stunned, humbled regret. She suddenly felt very small and very ordinary. The beautiful, sad melody continued for what felt like a long time. It was a moment of pure, shared vulnerability. The entire room was holding its breath, caught in the beauty of the music. Some people in the audience felt their own eyes welling up. They weren't just listening to a song anymore. They were feeling someone else's pain, and in doing so, they were confronting their own capacity for cruelty. But the sadness was not the end of the story. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the music began to build again. The gentle melody started to grow, gaining strength and complexity. Maya's hands began to move faster, the sound becoming fuller and richer. The sadness was still there, but it was now joined by something new. It was a feeling of rising strength, of defiance. The music was no longer just about the pain of being overlooked. It was about the power of rising above it. The sound grew and grew, layer upon layer of notes weaving together into a tapestry of sound that was both triumphant and powerful. The storm was back, but this time it wasn't a storm of anger. It was a storm of pure, unadulterated joy and strength. The melody soared, climbing higher and higher, a triumphant shout that echoed off the walls of the auditorium. Maya was no longer just playing the piano. She was conducting an orchestra of emotions, and the entire room was her instrument. Her body was swaying wildly now, her head thrown back, a look of pure ecstasy on her face. She was no longer the girl they laughed at. She was a force of nature, a powerful artist pouring her soul into the world, and she was absolutely breathtaking. The class that had mocked her was now completely and utterly at her mercy, hanging on every single note, speechless in the face of her incredible, unexpected power. The music reached its peak, a glorious soaring crescendo that filled every corner of the vast auditorium. It was the sound of a phoenix rising from the ashes, a voice that had been silenced for too long finally singing its true song. Maya's body was in complete sync with the melody, her head thrown back, her eyes squeezed shut, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on her face. She was no longer just a girl playing a piano. She was the music itself. Every note was a heartbeat, every chord a breath. The entire room was caught in this powerful current, held captive by the raw, beautiful energy radiating from the stage. They were no longer a collection of bored students and judgmental peers. They were a single, unified audience, completely and utterly mesmerized out then. With the force of a tidal wave crashing against the shore, the music came to its final, thundering conclusion. Maya's hands came down on the keys, striking a final, magnificent chord that was so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The sound was huge, a complex harmony that was both triumphant and slightly melancholic. a perfect summary of the entire emotional journey they had just taken. And then it hung in the air, vibrating with an intensity that was almost visible. It was a sound so big and so full that it seemed to swallow all other noise, all other thought, and then there was silence. It wasn't the awkward silence of before, or the bored silence of an uninterested crowd. This was a sacred, profound silence. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary and were struggling to process it. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if time itself had stopped, holding its breath along with the audience. The final chord faded away, leaving a void that felt heavier and more meaningful than any sound. In the front row, the girl with the blonde ponytail was frozen, her hands clasped together in her lap, her eyes wide and glassy as if she were staring at a ghost. The boy in the back was still leaning forward, his mouth agape, a look of pure, unadulterated awe on his face. For Maya, the silence was a slow, gentle return to reality. The passion of the music receded like a tide, leaving her feeling drained and empty, but also strangely peaceful. The world came back into focus, piece by piece. She felt the ache in her shoulders, the stiffness in her fingers. She felt the heat of the stage lights on her skin. She became aware of the quiet hum of the auditorium's ventilation system. Slowly she opened her eyes. The dark, faceless void of the audience came back into view. She saw the hundreds of figures all frozen in place, all staring at her. For a moment, a flicker of the old fear returned. What if they hated it? What if the silence was a sign of disapproval? Then, from the very back of the auditorium, a single sound broke the stillness. It was the sound of two hands clapping together. It was a sharp, clear, solitary sound in the enormous, quiet room. Clap, clap, clap. It was hesitant at first, but then it grew more confident. It was one person, standing up, showing their appreciation. That single act was like a spark in a dry forest. Another person joined in, then another. A few more people stood up. The sound began to grow, spreading through the room like a ripple in a pond. Then the ripple turned into a wave. A section of the audience in the middle stood up as one, their applause roaring to life. The sound was no longer just clapping. It was a thunderous, deafening roar that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Within moments, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that washed over the stage. It was a storm of applause, a wall of sound so loud and so full of genuine emotion that it took Maya's breath away. Students were cheering, whistling, and stomping their feet. The girl with the blonde ponytail was on her feet, clapping so hard her hands must have been stinging, a look of pure, unadulterated wonder on her face. The teachers were on their feet too, their faces beaming with pride and astonishment. Maya just sat there, her hands still resting on the keys, completely stunned. She watched as the sea of people rose before her, their faces a blur of smiles and cheers. This couldn't be happening. It was a dream. It had to be. These were the same people who had laughed at her just minutes ago, the same people who had ignored her for years. But here they were, giving her a standing ovation that was so loud, so full of energy, it felt like it could lift the roof off the building. A lump formed in her throat, and her vision began to blur with tears. But these weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of joy, of a feeling so profound she didn't even have a name for it. She slowly lifted her hands from the piano keys and placed them in her lap. She felt a single, shaky smile spread across her face. She didn't stand up and take a bow. She wasn't that kind of performer. She just sat there, a small, quiet figure on a huge stage, and accepted the incredible, overwhelming gift of their applause. When the roar finally began to subside, Maya slowly stood up. Her legs felt weak and wobbly, as if she had just run a marathon. She gave a small, awkward nod to the audience, a silent thank you, and then turned to walk off the stage. The walk down the steps was the opposite of her walk up. This time she didn't feel like she was walking to her doom. She felt like she was floating. The applause followed her, a warm, supportive wave that pushed her forward. As she walked down the aisle, no one was whispering or smirking. They were smiling at her, their faces full of respect and admiration. Sun reached out to pat her on the back as she passed, a gentle, encouraging touch. The girl with the blonde ponytail caught her eye as she walked by and gave her a small, genuine smile and a nod. There was no smirk, no arrogance, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had just happened. When Maya got back to her seat, the assembly was over. The principal didn't even try to speak over the lingering buzz of excitement. As the students began to file out of the auditorium, the atmosphere was completely different. People were talking about her performance, their voices filled with excitement. "Did you hear that? I had no idea she could play like that. That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen." Maya just sat in her seat, her tattered blue folder clutched to her chest, listening to it all. She was still the same quiet girl, but something inside her had fundamentally changed. The fear was gone. The shame was gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable confidence. The next day at school was even stranger. As she walked through the hallways, people she didn't even know were smiling at her and saying hello. A group of boys who had always ignored her stopped her by her locker. "Hey, that was—" "Wow," one of them said, struggling for words. "You were incredible." In the cafeteria, a girl from her math class came over to her table. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said quietly. That was beautiful. Maya was no longer invisible. She was the girl who spoke a language more powerful than words, a language that had left an entire class, and maybe even herself, completely speechless. She still kept her head down and she still spoke softly, but now, when she walked through the halls, she walked with a little bit more purpose, a little bit more pride. She had found her voice, not in speaking, but in playing, and the whole world had finally stopped to listen.